Now we're going to take a look at creating animation sequences that we can use over and over again and attach them to billboards for our renders. So I'm going to load in just one of the fire scenes that we had created earlier, and then we can take a look at the rendering options needed. Okay, so I've loaded in just our fire with the blue flames on the bottom. And if we plan on using this fire in a stationary manner, where we're not going to be rotating around it at all, and we want to have a set amount of certain time, then what we can do is first set up our animation. And we've already done that, and we have a 3-second animation for this specific fire. And what we want to do is render out an animation sequence that we can use to load into other scenes so that we don't have to re-render out the volumetrics every time we want to use this specific fire. So first we're going to go to our animation render options. And I'm going to set 24 frames per second. And we also need to take a look at our channels. Now currently we have this set to an AVI. Now typically with something like this, what you'd want to do is save out as either JPEGs or bitmap files. And if you go to Browse, or you take a look at the format options, and you can see our format options is currently for our AVI. So we can cancel that out. If we go to Browse and choose where we'd like to save our color files, we can select one of the image files because that's going to give us the best quality. Now JPEGs are compressed and they won't look as good as a bitmap, but they'll definitely take up a lot less space. There are also a very large amount of other image files we can use to save as, so really it's up to you which ones you'd like to use. But what we also need to make sure we do is turn on our alpha, because we want to save out our color and our alpha channel. I'm also going to set our frame resolution to 640 by 480. And up at the top, under animation limits, I'm just going to select render sequence, and that way I can specify exactly which frames I'd like to render. If we select render animation, it will render the entire animation and have the same effects, but if we want to, we can decrease the amount of overall frames that we'd like to include. Keep our frame increment at 1. And there's a couple other things too before we go ahead and render this. Now this scene's already set up specifically for this type of render. I'm just going to click OK for right now. But we have that black background loaded in with no ground plane. Now it's important when we're rendering that the only thing we're rendering is just the fire itself. If we have a ground plane or any other infinite plane or any other object, it's going to affect our alpha. If you've already set up a scene and you have infinite planes or any other objects that you'd like to keep, but you still want to render out the animation sequence, then what you can do is just right mouse click on whatever it is in the scene that you don't want to render and just go to hide from render. And you can just do that within your layers section. So any objects that you don't want to render, right mouse click, hide from render, and that way you're just focusing specifically on your fire object. So I'm going to go ahead and render this out, and then we're going to start with a new scene, and we're going to start loading in this image sequence that we're going to render onto a billboard or an alpha plane. And now I just have a blank scene. I'm just using the default atmosphere. And what we want to do is first load in our billboard or alpha plane. So we're going to go to the Objects panel, and all the way on the right we have our alpha plane. And we're going to select that and load it in, and our alpha plane options come up automatically. And I've already loaded in our animations into the browser. So we can click Load for our color picture. And now we can see the sequence of our fire animation in color. So we can select any number of the frames available for our color and click OK. And now it's going to ask us if we'd like to load in the entire sequence, because it's detecting the way the numbers are set up where we have underscore 0001 and then 0002 and so on, and it detects that automatically, and you can choose whether or not to just load in a single frame or the entire sequence. So we're going to select yes, we'd like to load in the entire sequence, and now we need to set up our alpha. And what the alpha will do is cut out all of the black area and anything that's not part of the actual material. If I just click OK right now, what's going to happen is we can see this black background and it's not transparent. So setting up the alpha will remove this black area. So we're going to double click and now we're going to load in our alpha picture. And I have a folder just for our alphas. And we can see the alpha is just a grayscale image, black being basically what's going to be cut out. Of course, we're also going to need to invert this because typically it's white that's going to be cut out of our scene. So once we invert this, we're going to have the outsides completely removed, and then we can see all these white areas for our flames, and also a nice gradient between certain areas so that we have a good amount of transparency. So I'm going to select our first frame, which is basically frame 0, click OK, and click yes to load in the entire sequence. And now we have our alpha being added, and if we take a look at our flames, we can see it's not really removing what we want. So we're going to go up to the upper right of our alpha picture and select invert. And now we're only seeing just the flames. What I also want to do is turn on Billboard, because right now we just have an alpha plane. I'm going to click OK, and we can take a look at that. And with an alpha plane, we can move to the sides and see this basically in 3D, where we can see it from the side and it's going to start to disappear and it's not going to look correct. Double click, if we turn on Billboard, click OK. Now our alpha plane is going to follow the camera no matter where we move it. We also have keep vertical on, and what that'll allow us to do is once we go up and take a look at it from another angle, it still stays in the correct direction, so it still is positioned correctly. Now we need to make some modifications in order for this to actually look correct in our scene. Right now it looks very dull, but that's because we don't have the same types of settings that we had before with luminosity and all the characteristics that really make up fire. And you can see we're totally affected by our light right now. So if we move this to a direction where the light's shining more directly on it, then it looks more correct. So let's adjust some of those values in the material editor and make some changes in order to make this look correct. I'm going to zoom in so we can see our whole fire. I'm going to double click in our preview so we can pull up the advanced material editor. If you're in the basic material editor, all you need to do is click on the button on the upper left to go to the advanced material editor. What I want to do is turn down our diffusion under the effects tab all the way down to 0. Also our ambient all the way down to 0. And then we can increase our luminous value, and I've got it at 100% right now. And we can see an overall brightness, and it looks pretty good, but we might want to go a little bit brighter. So I'm going to increase our luminous value to 150%. And now we can see it's much brighter, and it definitely looks a lot better. So I'm just going to click OK, and we can take a look at this from different directions. And because we have a 0% diffuse value, the light is not going to affect our object at all, which is what we want. And we can take a look at this from different distances, and it looks pretty good overall. I'm going to move this down so we're sort of intersecting with the ground plane, and that way our fire will actually look like it's on the ground. And you can also see we have a very nice shadow in the background that matches up correctly with our transparency and our alpha for our fire. And I'm going to need to bring this down just a little bit more. And now we're basically on the ground plane. So I'm going to zoom in, and let's go to our render options. I'm going to set this to final, render to screen, and select 640 by 480, and click OK. And now we can render this. And that only took 19 seconds to render. So it goes very quickly when we're just rendering our images. And if we were using something other than a spectral model, it would render even faster. Because images are basically already rendered, and all it really needs to do is just process the information on whatever objects we have. The only real calculations it needs to consider is the luminous value along with our transparency and alpha. Now we can notice a few artifacts in here where we have some black areas showing up where it doesn't quite look correct. So what we need to do is set up a filter for this transparency in order for it to look correct. And I'm also going to hit F11 on the keyboard just to bring up our timeline and our preview options and also our properties. And now I can scrub through our animation and we can see the animated images all showing up with the full sequence. Another thing to keep in mind is that these image sequences are entirely frame-based. So if we change our overall frame rate, and let's just take a look at our animation render options, and for that we're going to need to turn on a keyframe for something. So let's just add a keyframe for our position on our billboard. Go to our animation render options, and now we have it set to 24 frames. And that's going to match up with how we rendered and created the original animation for this fire. But if we were to bring this up to 30 frames a second, and click OK, our images are still based on 24 frames per second. And since we have more frames leading up to 3 seconds, we're not going to be able to see our full animated fire up to that point. And it's going to stop until we reach the last frame. So it's very important to keep that in mind while you're animating. So really you want to take a look at your image sequence, see how many frames it is, because sometimes it's just not going to match up to the total length of your animation. Now if we take a look at the actual function for this material, we can see we have some more options. So let's double click on our preview for our material, and we're going to go to the Color and Alpha tab, right mouse click on our preview for our image, and select Edit Function. And now we can see for our color, and I'll just zoom in so we can see that a little better. We have a lot of options for adjusting our overall image sequence. We can adjust the frame rate. And for the smoothest animation, you're going to want to make sure that this frame rate is equal to the frame rate of your scene animation. We can also offset our image in here and adjust our phase. So if you wanted to recenter it, you could easily do that, but it's usually best to have everything set up in the actual render when you render out the image sequence rather than having to rely on changing any settings afterwards. Now to get rid of those artifacts that we were showing before, we want to go to the Transparency tab, and under Transparency Production, where we can see our current image map loaded, what we want to do is just adjust our filter. So I'm going to make sure we're at frame 0, and I'm going to zoom in our camera so that we can get a better look in our preview render of the actual material and all those artifacts. And then under Transparency, we have this filter. We're going to right mouse click, go to Edit Filter, and now we can just ease this in and out and just make adjustments to make that disappear. So first I'm going to turn on curves. I'm also going to create a keyframe at 0, 0. So I'm going to click and drag all the way down to the lower left corner, create a new key point. So now we can have a much more even curve. And we can bring this down. And once we do that, we can start to see more of the edges. If we bring this in the other direction, take a look. you can see the overall transparency is starting to be removed. So we could also create a curve that is uneven, and take a look. And some of those artifacts are starting to be removed now, as we're dipping down in the beginning and starting to raise it up towards the top. We can start to see that disappearing. So we can add more key points if we need. I'll just click in here, create a new key point, adjust our curve, and we can move that down. And take a look. And now we can see a lot more intensity on the actual flames, and our artifacts are starting to disappear a little more. We can move that over, maybe pull that down. And drop it down even further, and now we really see all of those artifacts showing up, but much more intense flames. But typically you'll want to adjust the intensity of your flames not by the transparency map, but by your luminosity and your luminous value. So we could move that up and take a look, and now we can see we're moving a lot of the artifacts but losing some of our overall contrast. I'm going to leave it right there, click OK, and we're going to go to our Effects tab and increase our luminous setting up to 250. And now we can see it's much brighter, and if we zoom out and take a look, we can only just see those flames now, and it doesn't look like there's any artifacts or any little pixelation showing up. We can click OK. We can start to scroll through our animation, and we can just see that overall fire. So it really depends on how much you'd like to remove, how you would adjust that filter. If we wanted, we could have a little bit of that showing up in there, because at a certain point you do start to remove some of the finer details of your fire and whatever image sequence you're using. And if we compare our preview right now at frame 0 for what we had before, which is on the bottom showing up, compared to what we see in the main camera preview, we can see that we've lost some of our flames in certain areas and some of our detail. We also might need to bring down that luminosity just a little, so I'm going to bring that down to 215. Click OK. And now it matches up a little bit better. So if you need to, you can adjust that transparency filter, maybe bring some of those details back. But let's just take a look at a preview render for this. Since it's going to render very quickly, I'm just going to raise this up to 30 frames, because that's what we're currently working with. Final, click OK, and just let that render out. So now we can scrub through this preview and take a look. And you can really tell that a lot of the detail has been lost because of that transparency filter. So we can always adjust that to bring some of our details back. But if you don't want that graininess in there, you can definitely just use a filter to remove it. And then just fine-tune it until you get it to the point where it looks accurate. Another thing, if we take a look towards the end of the animation, you can see where we've run out of frames. We have this set to 3 seconds, but since we're using 30 frames a second, and our current animation sequence is set to 25 frames per second in the function editor, and we originally rendered this out at 24 frames per second, there's a lot of differences between everything, and you can see the last couple of frames, it starts to basically repeat itself, and we end up going back to the beginning frames. But this is still a very useful technique, especially if you're going to be using a lot of fire objects over and over again in different scenes, and you don't want to have to re-render out those volumetrics every time. And really, depending on how close you're going to be to that fire, you might not even need to create a very large image sequence. You could create something a little bit smaller. But that all depends on the overall scene, and it really varies on what you're working on specifically. And this is also the same method we would use if we were using purchased stock footage of fire. But in those cases, you're typically not going to have an alpha render. So there's a couple of things you can do. You can either use an image processing or post-production program and convert to grayscale. But if you have a black background, you can typically use the color map to generate the same sort of an effect. So let's just take a look at that right now. So we're going to ignore the alpha. We're going to do this in the function editor. First thing I'm going to do is just reset our transparency filter. And now we can see all of our detail coming back. And let's go back and edit our function. And I'm going to delete our link. And just actually we can delete the overall animation map. Delete those UV coordinates. And now we can select our transparency and have that go directly to our animation map. And I'm going to select our grayscale output. And now what we also need to do is still invert that because otherwise we're going to have the same problems we had before. So we're going to use a filter. And you could either use a standard filter, and we can go down to the -1, -1, create a new key point, and just modify those, and that will invert it. Or we can use one of the actual filters used for inverting. If we set that to opposite -x, we get the same effect. And it's a lot quicker than going in and using a filter. Of course, you can also set a new filter, and that way you can define some of those specific areas like we were before, where we're removing some of those pixelated areas and some of that graininess. So you could also just add a filter to that link. Click OK, and we can take a look. And in this case, it almost looks better that we're using the color map rather than the alpha, because we don't see as many of those artifacts. If you go to the Effects tab, we can change our luminous value up to 250, make it a little bit brighter. And now it works exactly the same way as our other map. And our billboard isn't going to show up the same way it did. But if we take a look at the render, we can see basically the same effect, and if we compare our frames, they're basically the same. We see a little more detail because we reset that transparency filter. But if you're using other stock footage other than the ones you're creating yourself, you can easily just connect to the color if it has a black background to remove whatever it is that's needed. So since we already have this set up, what we could easily do is just right mouse click and save our material, and that way we could load it up at any time and apply it to any billboard or alpha plane, and we'll be able to use this over and over again to create some really interesting looking fire and without having to re-render it. But of course it will stay completely stationary, and the billboard effect is very similar to older video games where you had sprites and graphics that would stay basically facing you until you reach a certain direction. Then normally they would change. In this case we don't have that, but it's still basically set up the same way because no matter where we move our camera, this fire is going to be facing us. So whether or not you actually want to rotate around your fire, you might need to render out volumetrics. But if you're going to be staying stationary, this is a really great way to sort of just use these simple planes and add fire to existing scenes. And if we just move this up a bit, And we can just throw an object in there. We'll just put in a sphere. And I'm going to load a material for this, just our default. And if we just have that going slightly over it, we can give the appearance that this sphere is on fire. We can scale that down to match up. And provided it's positioned correctly, you can get some really neat effects. And since the shadows still affect the overall scene, then it's definitely going to work for you. And since this image map is also still driven with a luminous setting rather than using the scene lights, we also have the ability to light our scenes specifically with these alpha planes. So if we're using radiosity, then the luminous factor will be taken into account, and we can actually light our scenes. And if we want to take a look at that, we can just delete our sunlight, and now we have just our fire in the scene. We're going to go to our atmosphere editor. Now it's going to say no directional light can be defined, and it's going to ask us whether or not we'd like to create a sun. I'm going to select no. We're going to turn on our global radiosity. We can increase our gain. And now you can see the more we increase our gain, we start to see those objects showing up. And our gain is currently set to black, which is also going to affect the overall look of our lighting. We could change that to more of an orangish color to match our firelight, but that's also going to light everything. And you can see as we adjust our gain and pull it down, the whole scene is still basically based on that color. And typically when you're working with radiosity, black is one of the best ways and one of the best colors to work with, or actually the lack of color. But we can see that we're lighting our scene and the sphere and the ground right now entirely with this fire object in just this image sequence. And the more we increase the luminosity for this fire, then the more light we're going to see. The more we increase our gain, we could go over the value of 10. You can see that a lot brighter now. And we see a little bit of overall distortion, but we can increase our quality boost, which will definitely take longer to render, but will increase the overall quality of our radiosity effect and lighting. And we can get some really neat looking effects.